it's not being talked about nearly enough. But if you look at the median age of plumbers, electricians, HVAC technicians in our country, their median age is extremely old compared to historical norms. Like our average electrician in this country is very close to retirement age. And we do not have a new crop of electricians coming out.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of What's the Alternative? I am Shana Orzik-Sissel, founder and CEO of Bondrian Capital Management. We had a slight hiatus for the holidays, but we are back, and we have with us one of our newest partners here at Bondrian. We have Sean O'Dowd at Scholastic Capital. He is a general partner. Scholastic Capital is a real estate private fund, and they focus on residential housing in the Midwest and the top school districts. So it's a really interesting niche. I know many of you will find it interesting, and I think as far as topics are concerned, residential housing markets is a hot one. So I'd like to welcome Sean to the show. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here. This will be fun.
Yeah, I think so too. Fun fact, Sean lives like walking distance from me. Um, and we've never had the opportunity to actually sit down in person. He probably could have come over and recorded this episode. But I digress. Sean, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into this niche and why you think it is such an interesting area for investment?
Yeah, for sure. So, how did I get into this niche? I originally from the Chicago area, and I'm the son of a teacher, and we moved 22 times before I went to college. So we bounced around a ton, and basically every year, new place. And with my mom being a teacher, was kind of pretty plugged into the school district element to it. And by the time I was like 13, 14 years old, on my 13th or 14th spot, it's like, hey, everywhere we live, like there's a really good school district in that area, and everybody knows that school district. Everybody is trying to get into that school district. So it was kind of an interesting observation there. And then I super fortunate. I went to Wharton for school, and then worked at BCG for consulting for a while, and learned to actually how to like build and test a thesis and a hypothesis there, and realized like there's actually an investment thesis around this idea of like there's really good school districts. So started buying homes with my own capital to see if I was right and if there was something. And it basically boiled down to like there's a big supply demand imbalance in these really good school districts. A lot of demand to be there. These are also areas that typically don't allow multifamily development. Typically areas where the median purchase price is north of $1 million to get in there. So you've got a lot of people who want to live there. There's not a lot of rentals available. If you can actually create a rental in a really good school district, you have a line of folks out the door who want to get there. And as a result, like you've got a really interesting, stable tenant base that makes a lot of sense for investment, makes a lot of sense for the tenants who want to be there.
Yeah, that makes sense in my mind as somebody who lives in one of said school districts and knows how difficult the market is here for renters. I totally understand that thesis. Let's talk a little bit about just housing in general. It's obviously a hot
Mm-hmm.
topic. Interest rates in general. I was watching the latest episode of The Compound and Friends, which is hosted by my friend Josh Brown and Michael Batnick, and they had another friend of mine, Doug Bonaparte, on recently, and they were talking about how in the current interest rate environment, there's sort of an interesting dynamic that we haven't seen,
Mm-hmm.
specifically that while rates have been cut by our Federal Reserve, the yield curve has actually been steepening, so rates are rising, and that has resulted in mortgage rates, which are based on the 10-year,
Mm-hmm.
going up and not down during a rate cut cycle, which is unusual. And as Josh put it, the only people that seems to hurt are the realtors. I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
But I'd love to get your take on that. Obviously we live in the northern suburbs of Chicago, which is a
Mm-hmm.
extremely affluent area with one of the top school districts. And,
Mm-hmm.
just observationally, I've noticed the inventory here is increasing slightly, especially with the rentals. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and houses are, for the longest time, there was no inventory, and we're seeing a slight
Mm-hmm.
uptick. So, can you talk a little bit about the current environment as it's residential housing, and like kind of what you're observationally seeing as it pertains to supply and days on market, things of that nature.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a little bit more supply than we saw before. And what's interesting is almost the vast majority of people who are selling right now are people who have to sell. The like voluntary, like I'm gonna sell this home and go buy a bigger home or buy a nicer home, buy a different home that I prefer better. That that person doesn't really exist right now because to your point on the rates, it doesn't make sense to sell a home with a 3.5% interest rate to go buy a slightly bigger home that's going to have a seven handle on it. The people who are selling right now are the folks who have to sell. And in most cases, that's folks who are relocation for job, it's folks who need to relocate for family reasons, folks who are now empty nesters and are downsizing. And it makes financial sense to sell. But when you don't have that voluntary seller in the market that you traditionally typically do see, and while inventory is a little bit higher because you have more of those need to sell folks, you don't really have the voluntary seller, which is until that individual comes back into the market, which is unlikely to happen until you see rates at a point where you could see that voluntary seller. It's gonna be really tough to expect inventory to really kind of spike up to what we've seen say over the past decade.
What do you think's driving the uptick in the people that need to sell? Um, economically speaking, we've fairly stable employment markets. Why do you think right now is the time that we're seeing that uptick in the folks that need to sell?
It's a good question. I think there's a variety of different elements to it. When we talk with agents, what they say most of the time is people relocating for work.
Mhm.
And in most cases, right now, that's related to like return to office stuff,
Okay.
where folks they took a different job during COVID. They've been working remotely, and it's like, okay, like they need me back in office now, and my office is in Atlanta. Like I'm going to Atlanta.
Mhm.
Or I'm getting a different job because I don't want to move to Atlanta, but then maybe I need to move a little bit further away. It tends to be from all of the conversations we have on a day-to-day basis with agents, it tends to be work related at this point, and that also tends to be return to office related.
That's really interesting. I never really thought of that. Um, in the Midwest, in particular, what are the markets that are most interesting? And some of the states in this area have a population issue where they have more
Hmm.
people leaving than coming. Is that affecting these school districts, or are the school districts that you would target, less likely to have that kind of um, immigration is not the correct word, but I can't think of a different word. But my migration from
Yeah.
some of the states here in the Midwest to the coasts.
It's a great question. So for us, we exclusively want to be buying in school districts that have been great for an extremely long time. They've gone through multiple school superintendents. Like one bad school superintendent can't destroy the place. It's a really established great school district. Like, we don't buy there, but like Greenwich, Connecticut, Palo Alto, California, like those kinds of places where you hear it and you're like, oh yeah, it's a good place. Um, what that means, though, is the population in these areas is almost exclusively flat for a 50-year period. And the reason why it's flat is we're buying in towns where there is no more land left to build. You don't have big tracts of land where you can just build a big housing subdivision because the area is so desirable. Every piece of land already has a house on it, and it's an area that typically doesn't allow multifamily development. So you can't like knock down a house and build an apartment building with 100 units in it. So the population's flat from that standpoint. That being said, there's always people who do move out, but because the area is so desirable, you've got people who are moving from like mid-tier locations to the highest tier school district. So you don't see the population growing because there's no more land to build, and you don't see the population falling because there's always somebody moving up to take the spot of the typically empty nesters who move out once their kids go to college.
That's really interesting. Around us, and
Hmm.
again, I just observationally talk about like the location I'm in because it's the location I know.
Hmm.
Um, your point about lack of land is an interesting one. First off, the thing you notice most here is knocking down houses to build a new house.
Hmm.
It's never, lots for sale. Although, in Winnetka, there was like a like a florist kind of greenery place
Yep.
that was like had been there for decades, and the owners were older and their children didn't want the business, so they sold it, and it was like three plots, and those three plots sold pretty quick
Hmm.
because to your point, it's in the most desirable school district in Illinois, and very difficult to find housing here. So when it
Hmm.
comes to rentals, though, you know,
Hmm.
I during the pandemic
Hmm.
looked for single family rentals in this area we're discussing, and I
Hmm.
remember how competitive the market was. As
Hmm.
you are going out and exploring opportunities, whether it be locally or in the expanded area of which you invest,
Hmm.
what are the key things that you look for, and how do you kind of approach the housing market? As you know, institutions have been in the headlines.
Hmm.
There's a lot of blowback on the idea of institutions and investors purchasing single family homes, which are already in rare supply, and then
Hmm.
putting them up as rentals and renting them at premium prices.
Hmm.
So how do you kind of approach the market, and what are your thoughts on the accusation that institutional investors are causing the housing market to be more expensive?
Yeah, for sure. So on our side and how we approach it, like we're looking for areas that have that supply demand imbalance, like really high demand to be there, and then not a lot of rental supply. And the easiest way that we check on the rental supply is you can pull IRS data by zip code,
Mhm.
and you can see the number of tax returns filed in each zip code. You can also see the number of those tax returns that claim the homeowner's exemption. So we buy in areas where 90% of the tax returns have the homeowner's exemption on it, meaning like 90% of the people own the home that they live in. There's not a lot of rentals available. National average for that is around 60%. So it's those kinds of areas where they're very hard to access from a rental perspective. So to that end, like on the institutional side, like there are some institutions that are wear different kind of colored hats in terms of how they approach this. We think we're on the right side of this equation. For us, like we in the way that we think about it with our tenants is like it is much easier for a gentleman or woman to afford a $3,500 a month rent payment than it is to save $350,000 for a down payment in one of these areas. We have tenants who send us Christmas cards. We have tenants who burst into tears when we tell them they get accepted because they didn't think they could get their kids into the school district. Um, I had an interview on the Chicago one of the news channels talking about our thesis, and I had about 300 emails in 10 minutes after I got
Wow.
off the air with people who were like, "I would like one of your homes. How can I get in there?" Like we think as long as we're on the side of, for lack of better words, like making these homes more accessible, we're on the right side of the question.
So, what's the different characteristics and attributes of a renter of a single family home versus the renter of an apartment? And what are the things that single family home rentals really covet?
For most cases, it's space because it's in most cases um, our average tenant has got a little bit more than two kids. It's like 2.3 kids on average across our tenants. So they tend to be families. It's three, four, or five people who are living in it, so they want space. We also have about 80% of our tenants have a dog.
Yeah.
So for most of our tenants, they want two bathrooms because there's parents and kids. They want an enclosed fence for the dog. It's cold here, so they want a garage. And that's at its core, like the most important things that they're looking for outside of the gimmies of like, hey, it needs to be in a safe location. It needs to be a nice house. It needs to be in good shape. It needs to be clean. It needs to be like very functional. And then we have additional things on top of that, like that we care about from a fund perspective. Like we're building this portfolio in a way where we could sell it down the line. So we're using the same institutional buy box criteria that the other guys are. So if we ever sell it to them, we can. So for that, it's like no homes on a street where the speed limit is faster than 25 miles an hour. It's got to be a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit street or less. So it's a safe place for the kids. It's easy to rent. Like no one's going to chase a ball into the street and get hurt. No solar panels. Institutions don't want them, so we can't buy a house with solar panels. No pools. They don't want them, so we can't buy a house with that. And then we've got a bunch of kind of like small things on the margins that we look like, but it basically ends up resulting in about 1.5% of the homes on the market at any given point are homes that fit all of the criteria that we're looking for houses to buy.
That's really interesting. Like I'm fascinated by this. No street with a speed limit more than 25 miles an hour. I wonder how like my area would fit because I live on the corner of a very busy street, but my actual address is on a cul-de-sac.
You're
Um,
good. You're
oh,
good.
okay. What other amenities do you see? And again, what are the difference between if you look at like the pool of renters that are specifically looking for single family homes and the pool of renters that rent apartments and the risks associated with it and that kind of thing? What really differentiates? And then as you look at your rentals, because obviously one of the key aspects of anything when you're investing in a fund like yours is the
Mhm.
risks of non-payment of rent, costs of eviction, things of that nature. And I'm curious if there's information you have, or if you guys have done any work that kind of looks at the different pool of renters in the two buckets and have any insight into those types of risks.
We've done a good amount of work there, and the big difference between the two of like folks who are looking for apartments versus folks who are looking for houses is the folks who are looking for houses typically have more kids, which as a result, just from like a pure data perspective, they tend to be much older. They're much later in life. They're further into their careers. They're a little bit more established. They've got a higher income as a result because they've been working for 20 plus years. They have 20 plus years of credit history. You have a much better understanding when you're underwriting the tenant of like, hey, who this person is. This person's has paid off their credit cards every month for 25 years. They've never been late on a rent payment in 25 plus years. Like you have a pretty high degree of confidence in who that person is and their ability to pay rent when they go for it. Um, uh, for example, our average tenant makes around $228,000 a year right now,
Mhm.
and it's a high earning tenant who's later in their career. They're 45, 50 years old is typically kind of our bread and butter tenant, and it's one of those things where, uh, from an amenity perspective and how they think about it, they're like, hey, most of our tenants, about 65% of our tenants, are moving into the area for their kids' high school where they
Okay.
say, "Hey, I've been in the area. Third grade is third grade, but I want them to go to a really good high school because I want them to go to Northwestern or U Chicago or Michigan or any one of
Mhm.
these Midwestern schools." So they upgrade school districts for high school so their kids can go to a really good high school. When they're done with high school, they no reason to be here in the cold Midwest anymore. Our tenants typically move to Florida or Texas or something like that afterwards. So the amenity that I'm getting to there is most of our tenants want to sign a multi-year lease.
Yes.
We typically have 3-year leases with tenants because they're like, hey, I don't want to risk losing this place after a year. Apartment tenants almost exclusively only want 1 year. Our tenants say, I want 3 years, 4 years because I don't want to risk losing it. I know I'm going to be here until my kid has a diploma. And then once I do have a diploma, I know I'm leaving, so I don't need to sign anything longer than that. So it makes it actually a much more straightforward conversation with tenants there as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I obviously I think we've talked about this. I rent the house I live in. It's
Mm-hmm,
not that a part of it is when I moved into a single family home, it was suboptimal time to buy. It was just such a
mm-hmm,
competitive market because it was COVID. And as you know, the area we live in it suddenly became like overrun with people looking for single family home rentals. In fact, there would be like, you know, 10 to 20 applicants and people would say I'll pay 6 months up front to
mm-hmm,
have this unit because they just wanted to get out of the city so that their kids could be outside and running around and things of that nature. And a lot of the schools in the suburbs went back to school in person sooner. And so
mm-hmm,
that also played a part. And it's funny because every place this is the second single family home I've rented, um, were multi-year leases right from the beginning, and the people who lived there prior to me had been there for a really long time. So like the place I
mm-hmm,
live now, the previous tenant had been there here for 6 years. It's entirely like I love the house I live in. Um, it's entirely likely that I will be here through my son's high school. My son is, going to be 10. So at least another 7 years that I intend to stay in this location. So I think that's really interesting, the stability of the tenant, and the
Hmm.
quality of the tenant, that you see. I find it interesting what you said about dogs,
Hmm.
because pet friendly in the apartment space is so much harder to find. Um, and to your point, families really love to have a dog. I have one and I'm getting a second. So I totally get it. As a landlord, though, how do you manage these properties? How do you mitigate the risk of damage as it relates to that? And then because these tenants stay for so long, what's involved in traditionally like the refresh? Is there aspects of the leases that are negotiated that have refresh? Do the families do work in the homes because they're there for so long and they want to make it more their own? Like, what kind of relationship occurs between you and these long-term tenants that have families, and how the property is kept, and
Hmm.
what is allowed, and then once they leave, what's that look like in terms of like refreshing the property?
For sure. So to your point on with tenants staying for a really long time, in a lot of ways, like the house becomes theirs because they're there for so long.
Mhm.
So most of our tenants do work to the house. Like it says in our leases, like they have the ability to repaint colors. Like if it's like neon or something, like we have to approve it.
Yep.
That's never happened, but most of our tenants like repaint the inside of the house to like a slightly different color. We've had tenants swap out light fixtures because they're like, oh, I really would like a different light fixture. We've had tenants like refresh, swap out like the handles on cabinets in the kitchen. Like we are totally okay with that because at the end of the day, like when someone is in a house for 1 year, it's like whatever. Like who cares? I'll put holes in the wall. Like I'm not gonna be here next year. Who cares? But when it's a tenant who's going to be there for 7 years, 6 years, 8 years, whatever it might be, like it's their house. They're going to take really good care of it. They're going to make the colors how the walls the colors they want, and they're going to preserve and protect the house. So when we have had tenants move out, the homes are in phenomenal shape because the tenants took care of it like it's theirs because they were there for so long. That being said, like with all houses and all in every single house, there's maintenance work. We're super fortunate on that. We have a ton of data from one of our advisors where we basically have a cost matrix against the vintage, meaning the year that the home was built, against the square footage of the home, and then the annualized maintenance expense for that house. So I can say like a 1973 house that's 1,800 square feet is exactly this much in maintenance.
Hmm.
And then we can get even more sharp and precise than that. That's like our first look when we actually are buying a home and we're inspecting it. We get make, model, serial number for every single piece of equipment in that house. So we can say, hey, this water heater is 4 years old. It's got another we got software that can get us to be very precise to say another 14 years left on the water heater. Water heater is going to cost this much to replace. We're doing it in 14 years. We need to be setting aside $18.50 every month for the water heater. The roof is this. The paint is this. So like we're basically escrowing every month a very precise number for that maintenance. So we have yet to have an issue where we're surprised with an expense or we don't have the money safely escrowed and ready for it.
Oh, that's fascinating. I replaced the AC unit at my home over
Hmm.
the summer during the heat wave. It just died. And
Mm.
to your point, my landlord didn't blink an eye. He was like, "Okay, yeah, I kind of knew that unit was on borrowed time." And it was quick and easy. And to your point, as a tenant, he basically told me like, find a guy, do it on your time, tell me how much it
Mm.
costs, make sure it's not outrageous, and just get it done. So it really empowered me as the tenant to kind of,
Mm.
again, treat it like it's my own home. The positive, of course, and the positive renting, and as much as people give it a bad rep, is that I got to control all of that, but I didn't have to write the check at the end.
Mhm.
And so I had a lot of ability to pick the unit that I wanted, the one that was going to be better for the home, which I intend to stay in for a long time. So this is all very fascinating to me because I have always thought that one of the areas that was so interesting in the residential real estate market was this type of residential, which there
Mhm.
wasn't a lot of. What are some trends you're seeing in single family rentals, even above and beyond kind of your niche, that you're seeing that potentially could be interesting investment opportunities as people look and explore this kind of differentiated way of participating in residential real estate?
I think there's a couple going on. One big one is the biggest SFR operators out there right now, um, by and large, are not buying individual homes on the MLS or real estate market anymore. They're buying portfolios. They're at a size and scale where it's just easier to do so. So for that reason, if you were to like make a list of all of the biggest SFR operators, there's Blackstone, Tricon, Progress, Invitation, but you can like pretty quickly fall down the list. There's not a lot of operators in the like 250 to 2,000 home range, and the
Mhm.
reason why is those biggest guys keep on buying the funds that are in that smaller size. So there's definitely an opportunity right now, and somebody could make a ton of money doing like a speed run. I'm gonna buy a bunch. I'm gonna lever up. I'm gonna buy a bunch of money. I'm gonna buy 1,000 homes over a 2-year period. I'm not gonna send any distributions to investors. I'm gonna buy 1,000 homes. I'm gonna lease them up, and I'm going to turn around and try to sell them as a portfolio to Invitation, and basically play portfolio aggregator for them. That's, I think, a really interesting opportunity. The other thing that's going on right now in SFR is insurance is becoming much more of an issue. And this is something that the bigger guys have been worried about for the past couple of years very quietly. Um, if you like plot where SFR funds are buying, they're not buying in Texas, they're not buying in Florida, they're not buying in Atlanta anymore, and those are traditional like SFR strongholds. In fact, like I firmly believe that they're like trying to slowly and quietly exit those markets. If you are an SFR, want to get interested in SFR, like I would become the SFR expert of Ohio, for example, because I think it's going to become a bigger SFR market. I've become the SFR expert of Pennsylvania, Tennessee, because those players are slowly moving north because it's just really hard to make an economic case for SFR in Florida and Texas right now.
Really interesting. I was wondering if you've noticed, I feel like I've noticed this, and maybe it's not something that's a trend, but it's just something I would notice. Um, Particularly and again, I refer to our area a lot. Viewers, sorry, it's just that it's the area I know. So, from
Hmm.
a standpoint of like when I'm thinking about the types of questions I have as somebody who would consider this type of investment, like I'm
Hmm.
obviously going to refer to the area I live in because it's what I know. But I
Yeah.
have noticed in like parts of west, southwest Illinois, like when you start getting out to like Naperville and that
Mm-hmm.
area, Aurora, I'm seeing these uptick in like developments of new construction single family rentals. Is that a thing? And if so, does that help or hurt the housing shortage? Because you're taking up these huge tracts of land, and instead of having a multi-use, multi-family building
Hmm.
of which you can have, 20 tenants, you're doing something where it's a single tenant. And is that exacerbating the issue of a housing shortage in the country?
It's very possible. I mean, the more people you have per square foot, like the more from like a multifamily perspective, the more people you can fit there. The challenge is most people want the backyard and they want the space, and it's um, it's difficult to get families in particular to want to live in multifamily buildings. But like multifamily buildings does give you a lot more bang for your buck from a housing shortage perspective. Um, and it's interesting too because there's a window of time right now. Which it's not being talked about nearly enough. But if you look at the median age of plumbers, electricians, HVAC technicians in our countries, meaning the folks you have to have legally because they have the license to build homes and multifamily buildings, their median age is extremely old compared to historical norms. Like
Mhm.
our average electrician in this country is very close to retirement age. and we do not have a new crop of electricians coming in. If you don't have electricians, you can't build anymore. Like the pace of building is literally legally bottlenecked by the number of electricians, HVAC technicians, plumbers that we have in this country. So like we've got kind of a window like now to be building while we have highly experienced, still in their working years folks. 5, 10 years from now, like there's going to be a drop, and like we should be building now as much as we possibly can, because I don't know what the solution is, but you're not seeing 20-year-olds sign up for those jobs in the way that you have in previous generations, and without them, like we literally can't build houses or
Interesting.
multifamily.
Interestingly, I'm gonna kind of like go a little off topic here because that's fascinating. I actually have family that are contractors and unions like plumbers in this area. And they, to your point, they're older, but their kids are getting into the family business because of the opportunity set. Do you think that how do we solve that problem? Yeah, if you think about what you're saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
It very, very interestingly correlates with the end of home ec and shop classes and traditional education. And then the other issue I can think of is if I, for example, wanted to become an electrician, I wouldn't even know how.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, if you want to become a doctor or a lawyer, you go to law school, you go to this school. Like, if I wanted to become an electrician, how do I even do that? Right? Like, you
Yeah.
don't see schools popping up. There's no like very clearly communicated roadmap to the public of like, if you wanted to be involved in the trades, these are the steps you need to go. We don't teach high school kids, okay, you can apply to college or you can apply to trade school. Oh, where are the trade schools? Because you don't see them anymore. Do you think, like, how off topic a little bit, but fascinating, how do you
Yeah.
think we as a society have to address that? Because to your point, I never thought of that impact on the residential housing market, which already has some really fundamentally bad issues that are going to be really hard to solve,
Mm-hmm.
if what you're saying comes to fruition.
It's a good question, and I I'm probably not the person no, I'm not the person to solve it, but I think there should be more visibility and accessibility to those kinds of careers, and people need to, for example, have options in high school to take home ec shop, like those sorts of things, to learn these things. I mean, uh, there's there's a really fascinating data point of like if you go back 150, 200 years, like 70% of Americans were in the agricultural industry. We were all farmers because we needed to. And now in America, it's less than 1% of folks are farmers, because the industry has become like more automated. You've got these big John Deeres. You can do a lot more with just one person than you used to be able to do. Uh, for agriculture, like that's fine. You can drive a big tractor. Like you can't do that for as an electrician. Like there is no way, at least that I'm aware of, to automate and speed up being an electrician. If you screw it up, the house burns down. It has to
Right.
be done very accurately. It has to be done by somebody who knows what they're doing, and they have to be highly focused on one house at a time as they do it. You can't just like drive a big John Deere tractor through it. But I think a lot of people seem to have this perception of like we don't need electricians. Like no, we do, and I am extremely confident home prices will go up if we stop building homes, and if we don't have the licensed, experienced folks who know how to build homes, like we're not building, which means home prices go up.
Fascinating. Honest to God, this is fascinating discussion. I think that's it. Yeah. Again, another thing that's like, wow, I never thought of that, is that you can't use technology. There's really no way to use technology to scale electricians or electrical work, because it's so specific to that home and that building, and like there's no computer
Hmm.
that can you get like, how would you I wouldn't even know where to begin. And
Yeah,
how does it, can AI solve some of it? Is that a possibility? Like
I don't know.
I personally might go to Chat GPT and see if it could tell me how to fix an electrical problem. But as an individual, I don't know if I would want to test that theory, because if I screw it up, I could like electrocute myself. It's not like if you screw up the plumbing because Chat GPT did it wrong or you didn't do it correctly, it's not going to like potentially destroy your house,
Hmm.
electrocute you, like harm you, and like it's so fascinating. This went in a
Hmm.
direction I did not expect, but truly fascinating. So let's get into like your thesis for this investment strategy.
Hmm.
What are the interesting aspects of it that you think is worth a second look, that's really differentiated? And let's talk about things that a lot of advisors and their clients think about when they think about
Hmm.
investing in real estate, which is like, what's it called? Um, any kind of tax related,
Mm.
transactional, transitioning from one type of real estate investment to another, things of that nature. Like, what are some things that people should consider as it relates to your strategy and your particular niche?
For sure. So I
1035
think
exchange. Thank you. Sorry.
yes. I at its core, like I think of it. This is like highly simplistic, but I think it's important framing. Like on like a risk scale of like a 0 to 10, with 10 being highest risk, and like reward 0 to 10, 10 being highest reward. Like we are trying to be like a 6 or a 7 on the reward and like a 3 or 4 on the risk. Like
Mhm.
we are never going to be the highest yielding. Like we're never going to beat a real estate development deal that goes right. Our odds of going to zero are substantially lower than that. Like we're trying to be like a real estate bond for our investors. And the way that that comes out, because we have high paying tenants with long-term leases, we pay out monthly distributions to our investors. And those distributions, because we do depreciation and cost segregation, for most investors, everyone's situation is different, but for 99% of investors, in our experience, our distributions are tax free. So they get basically tax-free cash into their bank account on the third Friday of every month. Um, and the other element to it is like we do have the underlying equity in the fund as well. Our fund admin marks NAV every quarter. We are up 7.3% right now since April. So it's a kind of a three-part return. The first is the actual monthly distributions. The second is the depreciation that makes those tax-free, and there's actually excess depreciation. So if someone else has other cable income, it could potentially have that be tax free as well. And then it's the equity balance that comes up as well.
Interesting. So, talk a little bit about the strategy, the specific
Mhm.
geography you focus on, and then you talked about the equity. How do you monetize some of these things? Obviously, you want the cash and the income from the leases, but in in what scenarios would you sell a property, and how would that sale kind of come to be? What's kind of the life cycle of a typical investment in your strategy?
For sure. So we are going back to the insurance piece that we talked about earlier. Like we are intentionally buying homes in the Upper Midwest because of insurance. Like we believe the bigger SFR funds are moving north, and we basically want to be a big shiny portfolio sitting here when they're moving because they like buying portfolios. And that's also why we're being very thoughtful to follow their rules on buying houses. 25-mile-an-hour speed limits. That's their rule. We're following it for a reason. So when they underwrite our portfolio, it passes. They care about Starbucks locations. They care about Costco locations. Like we care about those too for those reasons. Um, so for us, like and monetizing that equity, there's a couple of different ways that could come through. Number one is if we do any refinances in the portfolio and return cash. That's not something we promise investors because we don't know what rates will do. But if rates go down to 4%, like I'm gonna sign that LOI to refinance, and investors get a nice check back, and that should have no tax implications because it's not a sale, it's a refinance. Uh, the next element would be voluntary withdrawal. And investors can pull their cash out of the fund after a lockup period, and they get that back at NAV value. So if they say 7 years from now their kids are going off to college and they need to write a big check to a college, like they can pull their money out and uh, use that. And then the last piece would be that sale period down the line, like we're building the portfolio for a potential big sale. down the line to a large institutional player who will overpay for a portfolio because it's a portfolio and it'll be worth more than the sum of its parts.
Do you ever have situations where your tenants want to buy out the property? And do you ever consider that?
We do. We have had that happen before. The challenge with it is the tenants are valuing the homes at what the home would sell on the standard real estate market, and that's typically less than what the home is worth as part of a portfolio.
Oh,
So there's theoretically like it could happen, uh, but it's unlikely because if the home is worth, call it 500 on the real estate market, but we think it's going to be worth like 620 when we sell it in a portfolio, it's really hard to make that sale because the seller is going to need to get a mortgage for 620 and it's not going to appraise for 620.
how does that work in terms of the impact on real estate statistics in the area? When you're
Mm.
selling a home as part of a portfolio, does that affect like comps in the area? Does it get put into the MLS system in that respect? And how does that kind of work?
It does. So it does get logged at that sale price. So it does impact comps in the area. The comps theoretically would go up as we sell a portfolio.
Ah, interesting. Um, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing these days.
I agree. You can make a case either way.
Yeah, it could make like a specific house on a street screw up like what is realistically what a buyer would pay for a home on that street for everybody who's trying to sell individually versus the one that gets sold as part of a portfolio, and just really mess the square footage comps. um, Interesting from that perspective. So as you think about opportunities going forward
Mhm,
and the issues we're having in the housing market right now, what are
mhm.
your biggest concerns as it relates to that? And then where are you seeing the opportunities going forward?
I think my biggest concern by far is just the construction of new inventory. Like as if the population is growing and the inventory is not growing at the same rate, like you're just naturally creating a scenario where there's more people than houses. I think that's by far the biggest risk. On the opportunity standpoint, what's interesting about real estate is like there's so many different cuts and flavors to it. And it's such a large market where you can become really sharp at any one tiny specific niche thesis and get value out of it. Um, I know of some groups, for example, who are doing really well right now with housing for military service members near military bases. It's a very it's they're doing extremely well. That's one in particular that I think is a really interesting niche right now. But there's a lot of really cool kind of cuts and flavors to the real estate market right now.
Yeah, it's funny the military thing, workforce housing
Mm,
as an investment strategy is one that has been coming up a lot recently when we talk to advisors,
mm,
because their clients are looking for ways when you think about affordable housing of how do we support our first responders, how do we
mm,
support our teachers, how do we allow them to live in the communities that they serve,
mhm,
and it's a big problem in the markets today, especially in the markets that you play in, um,
mhm,
which are insanely expensive. And most of the time, uh, the workforce that supports that community, whether it be police or fire or EMT or teachers, don't and can't live in the community because they're just completely priced out.
mhm,
And that continues to be a problem. So
mhm.
I think it's really interesting where those opportunities. Do you ever see a scenario where as you grow and expand Scholastic Capital, you would expand into potential opportunities that are niche like that, or is that too far away from your core area of expertise?
I think it's too far away from our core area of expertise, but we do think about the things that you're talking about, and um, like some of the towns that we live in, like we are the largest landowner. Like we own more property in that town by just number of properties than anyone else. Um, so to your point on like police, fire, local libraries, like um, we are technically like the largest player in that town, like we should be doing more outside of just paying property taxes to support our local policemen, our local firemen. And we've got a couple different things that we're doing to that step, but like we do think we have a role to play and a role that we should be playing to support the local community, just because we are literally the biggest landowner in town.
Do you ever consider potentially making a portion of the properties in your portfolio kind of focused on supporting that part where maybe you're not getting market rent, but you're making it affordable for the workforce?
We have. That's something that we are extremely interested in doing, and I think we will very likely do.
Yeah, I think advisors feel free to leave a comment underneath if you agree with me on this. But I do think that there is a lot of people that would support and want to invest in a product that did that. As we think about the demographics of
Hmm.
investors as the baby boomers kind of become less and less of the investor pool, and Gen X and millennials and Gen Z are coming into the wealth and
Hmm.
looking for areas of which they can invest. That those generational groups are far more interested in investing in things that are supportive to their core values in their communities. And there's certainly a lot of demand in the investor pool, especially in the wealth management channel, which is typically supported by financial advisors and as individual
Hmm.
investors. There's certainly a large demand and a pool of individuals that want to be investing for the greater good, but also make a good investment. So I think that's really interesting. Keep us updated if you do decide to make that kind of shift and have maybe like 20% of your portfolio being focused on that. I think that would be something that a lot of advisors would be interested in. I do really appreciate your time. I actually find this very fascinating. Again, I apologize to the viewers. A lot of my anecdotal stuff is just based on the area I live, which is a fascinating area to live because anyone who's familiar with the Chicago area, it's very fragmented. It's like either very poor or completely insane. And Sean and I happen to live in one of the areas where it's completely insane. We both live in the same town, and there's the town that we live in is this weird fragmentation of ridiculous homes that are like tens of millions of dollars. And then these smaller, like split level ranches, which go on the market for like $1 million, but they're like 2,000 square feet because of the town it's in. But like the actual house is nothing special. And it's a very interesting kind of place to be and observe. I like to joke when I drive around, there's a lot of people on social media that make comments about, rich people don't drive expensive cars. And I would like them to come to like Winnetka or Kenilworth or Wilmette, even Evanston, and look at the average parking lot at any supermarket. And I would
Yeah.
beg to differ with that assumption because I drive down the street and you're far more likely to see somebody driving a Porsche than a Toyota. And it's prominent. It's not like one or two.
Yeah.
So I beg to differ with the idea that rich people don't drive fancy cars because there's lots of fancy cars where I live, and there's lots of rich people. So I think it's really interesting everything that you're doing. I think what you're doing is fascinating. If you're an advisor who's interested in learning more about Scholastic Capital, let us know. I think you'll be really impressed with Sean and his team. But above and beyond that, as we think about ways as you are approaching retirement and looking for potential income opportunities, or if you're concerned about tax consequences and things of that nature, this is a strategy that can really solve for a lot of that. So definitely worth considering and looking at and the scope of like potential opportunities as you consider the myriad of opportunities and not just real estate but alternatives in general. So thank you so much for your time, Sean. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot, and you've made me think about some things that I never considered as I think about the housing market issues here in the United States. So again, everybody, thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Feel free to like this video if you have ideas or types of strategies and managers that you want to hear from. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you subscribe to this. And we'd love it if you left us a review and let us know what we're doing well and any feedback on what we could be doing better. So thank you for your time. And again, this is Shana Orzik-Sissel, founder and CEO of Boundary and Capital Management. And you are watching What's the Alternative? Have a great day.
Let's go boom.
The opinions expressed on the What's the Alternative podcast are for general informational purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or in any specific security. This is only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this podcast is no guarantee of future results. The guests featured on this program are participants on Boundary Capital Management's platform. As such, Boundary may receive payment for their participation as a platform partner. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. As always, please remember investing involves risk and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed investment professional. Investments are not FDIC insured, nor are they deposits of or guarantees by a bank or any other entity, so they may lose value. Investors should carefully consider investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. This and other important information is contained in the fund prospectus and summary prospectuses, which can be obtained from a financial professional and should be read carefully before investing. Statements attributed to an individual represent the opinions of that individual as of the date of the published podcast and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Boundary and Capital Management or its affiliates. This information is intended to provide educational value, highlight issues, and should not be considered advice, an endorsement, or a recommendation. All Boundary and Capital trademarks mentioned are owned by Boundary and Capital Management, Inc., an affiliated company, or its funds. All other company and product names mentioned are the property of their respective companies.